Good afternoon. I'm Vincent Wang in the Department of Political Science. Welcome to the lecture by Professor Michael Yahuda. Professor Yahuda is one of the world's most respected scholars on Chinese politics, foreign policy, and East Asian affairs until his retirement from the London School of Economics. By the way, it's one of our partner institutions, so if you have any question, you can ask him. So until his retirement from London School of Economics in 2003, he had been a professor of international relations at the LSE for 30 years. He is currently a visiting scholar at the Seeger Center of Asian Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In fact, it is this information on his most recent affiliation on one of his recent publications, China's Taiwan Dilemma, on Yale Global Online, that gave me the clue to track him down, and the good fortune for us to have him to the University of Richmond on such a beautiful day today. Professor Yahuda's distinguished career spans more than 4 decades. He was trained in modern Chinese language and literature and Chinese government and politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, the preeminent UK institution on Asian studies, and the publisher of China Quarterly. He first taught at the University of Southampton before moving to the London School of Economics. In addition, he has been a visiting research fellow and guest scholar at leading Australian and American universities and institutions, including the University of Michigan, the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Studies at Harvard University. Professor Yahuda has published many books, including The International Politics of Asia Pacific, 1945 to 1995, Hong Kong, China's Challenge, China's Role in World Affairs, Toward the End of Isolationism, Chinese Foreign Policy After Mao, Patterns of Regionalism in Asia, New Opportunities for the 1980s, and the most recent one, International Politics of Asia Pacific since 1945. He told me that he will submit it to the press really soon, so we can look forward to its publication later this year. And congratulations on one more book. In addition, he has published more than 150 scholarly articles and chapters in books, including the chapter on Chinese nationalism in the book Asian Nationalism, which my students in Politics Asia have recently read. Today, Professor Yahuda will speak to us about a subject that I believe is important to everyone, namely, what does a rising China mean to its neighbors, to the United States, and the world? After his speech, you will have an opportunity to ask him questions. It is our honor and the pleasure to welcome Professor Yahuda.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wang, for such a wonderful introduction. The trouble with such wonderful introductions, it's all downhill after that. But anyway, I'll try and bring before you what I think are the key issues involved here. In the last few years, in the last few years, I think a lot of attention has been given to something called the rise of China, and to sense that China has become more active in the diplomacy in East Asia. China is seen now as a key player in addressing the North Korean problem, and in addition to which, the Chinese economy is now recognized as the driving force for the economies of East Asia. And China now attracts more investment, more foreign direct investment than any other country in the world today. It's the proportion of world trade that it commands has doubled in the last 10 years, and it now ranks, I believe, at about 8% of total world trade. And in that sense, China is seen as as a rising power that therefore faces new challenges for itself, but also poses challenges for the world as a whole. As we all know from the 20th century, the rising powers have, at least on 2 occasions, been the causes of major wars. The rise of Germany, seen as the underlying cause for the First World War and possibly the Second World War. And of course the rise of Japan also led to the Pacific War, which was part of the Second World War. And therefore the Chinese are very keen to suggest that their rise need not necessarily entail such dangers to the world as a whole and indeed to itself. And in this sense, the Chinese today talk about something called a peaceful rise. And to this end, they can point to a number of different developments which are very new in China's modern history. One is that the Chinese have become very proactive in the development of multilateral institutions. Hitherto, the Chinese preferred to deal with neighbors, especially, on a one-to-one basis. Clearly, the stronger power has many advantages in dealing with a smaller country on a one-to-one basis, rather than dealing with them collectively, in which the smaller powers, if you like, can bring their own pressure to bear more skillfully, if you like, by doing it collectively rather than separately. Nevertheless, the Chinese have found it in their interests to develop these multilateral relations, especially with their Southeast Asian neighbors. Now, the part of the reasons for doing so is in some sense to counter this sense of what has been called the China threat. In other words, as China was becoming more influential through its economic development in the affairs of its Southeast Asian neighbors, they were mindful of periods in the past where the Chinese had used their greater power, their greater significance, as a way of demanding that the others acknowledge its superior position. And in the case of more recent times, the Southeast Asian states have very clear memories of China in the period of Mao Zedong, seeking to encourage communist revolutions in their countries. And therefore, there was a degree of unease about the growing influence and perhaps power of China in the region. This was accentuated by the fact that there are disputes as to who owns the chain of reefs and shoals known as the Spratly Islands. Now, the Chinese claim the whole of them, and if the Chinese claim were to be carried out, it would in fact bring Chinese power right down to the heart of Southeast Asia, within about 120 miles of the coasts of the Philippines, of Borneo, and smack up against Malaysia. And indeed, it would transform the South China Sea into almost a patrimonial lake of China. So clearly the Chinese felt it was in their interest to seek to assuage its neighbors to the south, that China was trustworthy, that China's growing influence was not necessarily going to be at their expense. And for China, in the early part of the 90s, this was seen as very important because of the continual differences with the United States. The China that came out of the disaster of Tiananmen was subject to sanctions led by the United States. And then then after that, there was pressure on the Chinese over the question of human rights, when it seemed as if the trading relationship with the United States would be held hostage to that in the Clinton administration. And it was only in 1994 that that issue was settled. And then in 1995, there arose a problem with the United States over the question of Taiwan. And I'll come back to the question of Taiwan a little later. So it was around 1995 that the Chinese first indicated to the Southeast Asians that it would deal with them collectively rather than separately, one by one. And that was seen as a major achievement by the Southeast Asians. Now that first opening has since thickened considerably. The Chinese have gone out of their way to try and show the Southeast Asians that China is sympathetic to their concerns, that it is willing to listen to their demands, that it is willing to play a constructive part in their own development. And just recently, the Chinese have announced that they would be prepared to have a free trade association with the Southeast Asian countries. The Chinese have also signed and they were the first non-Southeast Asian country to sign what's called the Treaty of Peace, Accord and Amity, which the Southeast Asians first developed some years ago as a code of conduct in terms of governing international relations in that part of the world. The idea being that conflicts or differences should eschew the use of force, that they should respect each other's sovereignty, and that they should seek to conduct their relationships on a consultative basis. And the Chinese have also sought to extend this view of a consultative approach more broadly. In the late 90s, they developed what they called a new security doctrine. Now, this security doctrine is supposedly based on cooperative security. Now, cooperative security was something that was the concept was first developed by the Scandinavians. The idea being that an alternative was needed for alliance systems. Alliance systems, it was argued, was something that sharply differentiated between friends and enemies, if you like. The idea being that you formed an alliance to address a common threat. Here the argument was that cooperative security was required for the handling of relations between countries that were neither, if you like, close friends and allies, but nor were they adversaries. And the idea was that they would seek, first of all, to build trust between them through various confidence-building measures by, for example, notifying each other about military exercises, allowing observers from each side to take part in the military exercises, to, if they had common borders, to try and reduce the level of armed forces deployed near the borders, notify each other of patrols, and so on. Also to produce white papers every year which would explain the nature of their defense dispositions, what their strategies were, and so on. After a degree of trust had been built, the idea then would be that, again, through operating by consultation and consensus, they would move towards something called preventive diplomacy. That would be to try and identify what were the areas amongst the participants which were sources of conflict or were already areas of conflict, and then try and find ways of addressing those issues, trying to see how the sources of the conflict could be contained. I sort of try and narrow the areas of disagreement, try and find ways in which consultation, negotiations about these matters could take place. See maybe if you could have third-party mediation and so on. And then after that, the idea would be to move to a third stage, which would be conflict resolution, in which, again, either amongst themselves or through the intervention of third parties, they would seek ways in which to end the conflict, whether it would be one of disputed territories or what have you. Now, the Chinese adoption of this new security doctrine focused much more on the issue of confidence building, focused much more on the issue of trying to build trust. And initially, it was presented as an alternative to the American alliance system, which still determined much of the security in the East Asian region. As you may know, the United States has a series of separate alliances with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with the Philippines, and with Thailand. And these are all, in a sense, on the maritime periphery of East Asia. They have existed since the beginning of the Cold War, and at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, they were, in a sense, transformed into being bases for providing security in the sense of maintaining the status quo in the region. That it was the United States which not only provided military security, but it ensured that the sea lanes through which most of the trade passed would be secure, and in addition to which the United States also had traditionally maintained its markets relatively open especially to Asian products, so that these countries which sought to develop themselves primarily through export orientation would find access to the United States and would also have access to American technology and and also with American encouragement, they would be able to participate in the international economic trade nexus involving the International Monetary Fund, involving the World Bank, and of course also the World Trade Organization. So in a sense, America provided the framework for stability in strategic terms, and also for what economists call the public goods in the whole of the region. And indeed, even though the Chinese might not like to admit it very openly, China was a beneficiary of these arrangements. After all, it's in 1979 that the Chinese reframed the whole approach to development and moved away from Mao's emphasis on self-reliance to engaging in economic reform and openness to the outside, and that's what that's something that they have persisted in, and it is through pursuing those policies that they've been able to reach the point that they have reached now. And In that sense, China is fully engaged in the international economy and is becoming more enmeshed in it as time goes by. However, being still a communist-run system, the Chinese are very anxious to distinguish in ways that we don't between economic globalization and political independence. In other words, we tend to think of globalization as somehow a huge tide that carries with it not only economics, but social changes, cultural developments, and political ones as well. The Chinese seek to differentiate between what they would regard still as their sovereign rights of political independence as somehow separate from economic globalization. And to this end, they have sought to find ways to engage their neighbors in ways that still uphold these 2 points. But with regard to the United States, the Chinese have long felt that the United States represents not only an alternative center of power in the world, but a center of power that is seeking to change China. That when the American administration, for example, talks about constructive engagement, it doesn't just mean what the Chinese would understand to be peaceful coexistence. In other words, you have your system and we have our system, and we've got to find ways of getting on. The American ideas of engagement has always seemed to the Chinese to involve seeking to change China. And indeed, if you listen to American leaders talking about it, they always see it as somehow or other as a means to something else. China's entry into the World Trade Organization is seen as a means of getting the Chinese to observe more the rule of law, to get the Chinese, to encourage the Chinese middle class, which in time is seen as encouraging liberalism in China, which will in time lead to democracy in China. So that for the Chinese, therefore, dealing with America has always been seen to them a rather difficult matter. And so when they first developed the idea of this new security doctrine, they put it in opposition to the American alliances. And their neighbors found themselves feeling very much under pressure as a result, because it was much easier for them to have this new relationship with China, knowing that America was there somewhere just over the horizon, that America was, if you like, the guarantor of security, that this would be a constraint on the Chinese. This made the neighbors feel they had a bit more space, in a sense, to deal with China. And what is interesting about more recent developments of the Chinese, and this is associated with their idea of a peaceful rise, is, as the new Prime Minister told Colin Powell only 18 months ago, that we Chinese, that is, do not seek to push you Americans out of Asia. Meaning that the Chinese were now accepting the American alliance system. And in that sense, they were accepting, if you like, American unipolarity, American hegemony, American preeminence, or whatever word you want to give to it. Obviously, as seen by China, this was seen as an expedient measure. Not an expedient measure for 1 year or 2 years, but expedient measure for about 20 years. Because by their reckoning, if they carry on with the current rates of growth and so on, by 20 years' time, they will have reached the point of being comfortable that they would have reached the economic level of, say, maybe today's Spain or Portugal, perhaps. This would give them that their people would have been lifted from a status, if you like, of third world relative poverty to reaching a level of developed countries. And so therefore, the argument was this was a long-term strategy. This new diplomacy has therefore been seen by many as showing that China is now really being fully integrated into the international community. Alongside this, the Chinese have joined all the major arms control agreements, the non-proliferation agreements. The Chinese also are partners with the Americans and others in the war against terrorism. The Chinese, as I mentioned earlier, were seen as playing a very constructive role in seeking to manage the diplomacy of the North Korean problem. The Europeans regard the Chinese now as partners. The Chinese have also developed what they call the Shanghai Cooperative Organization in dealing with Central Asia, which is partly to do with seeking to limit terrorism and Islamic extremism, but it's also seen as something to encourage economic development on the west of China and in Central Asia. Now, this approach, in a way, has been welcomed by the United States, as by others. But I think a moment's consideration will show that there are still problems, and there are still issues to be tackled in the future. One stems from what we would regard as the contradiction between having, if you like, a market economy and having Communist Party rule. In this particular case, the Communist Party has been able to retreat from many areas that it used to control to allow the market to continue, but it nevertheless feels still nervous about the basis of its legitimacy, and to that extent it has encouraged the development of what they call patriotism, or we would regard as nationalism, as a way of cementing the loyalty of the people when obviously the ideology of communism has lost a great deal of its substance, really, because you can't run a market economy and claim that you are building towards a new socialist communist future, and this has caused also the dismantling of much of what was of the command economy, and so the emphasis on nationalism or patriotism has been seen as a way of cementing the relations between the leaders and the people, and that therefore the Communist Party is seen as serving the cause of the people of China as a whole and serving its nationalist interests. Now, where this creates a problem is, say, in the case of Taiwan, for example. Now, Taiwan and China have also had their relations changed considerably because of economics. Taiwan has invested something like over $100 billion in China. There are hundreds of thousands of people from Taiwan who now live in China. The trade between them is very great. It's important to both economies. They have become, in many respects, interdependent, and that growth has gone on. But at the same time, the people in Taiwan have become more conscious of their own separate identity. And Beijing claims that Taiwan is a part of China, that it was allowed to separate from China only because of the interference of the West, mainly the United States, and that because of China's experience of 100 years of humiliation at the hands of the West and Japan, China will be incomplete unless Taiwan is returned to the embrace of the motherland. Now, the consequences of this being that the people in China, the leadership in China has persuaded itself that unless they can deploy a great deal of force against Taiwan, the independence forces in Taiwan would gain sufficient ground as to declare independence. And therefore, the argument is that if Taiwan were to move towards independence, Beijing would have no alternative except to use force. Now, of course, that in itself would be very destructive of the whole position of China's new diplomacy and of the whole position of peaceful rise. It would be seen, it would upset the Japanese considerably, who would find their own strategic environment adversely affected. It would make the neighbors worry a great deal. What was this new China really about? It was prepared to use force over Taiwan today. What about the disputed islands in the South China Sea tomorrow? But perhaps the greatest point about it is that it would involve China in conflict with the United States. The United States is committed, has a commitment to Taiwan. It's not a full-range alliance. There are degrees of ambiguity in it, but nevertheless, it's the United States deployed two aircraft-led battle groups in 1995 or 1996 rather, when the Chinese side fired missiles near the shores of Taiwan, the basis in order to intimidate the island. And it was when the United States brought these two aircraft-led battle groups that the problem was resolved, because the Chinese then stopped. And in this sense, the Taiwan issue remains a major problem between the United States and China. And it's one in which the Chinese claim, in effect, that they would have no alternative to use force if the leaders of Taiwan should do certain things they don't like. Because if a leader were to be seen to be soft on the Taiwan issue, he would not remain a leader very long. So the argument is that there's nationalist pressure within China that prevents a kind of an accommodation. So that's one big problem that is there, and there's no real easy answer. Another problem that exists has to do with Japan. China and Japan, perhaps if you like Taiwan and China, have a very successful economic relationship. It's had its problems, but in the last 3 or 4 years, it's grown by leaps and bounds. So much so that that Japan is a more important economic partner to China than the United States is, by far. Yet, within China, there's still enormous animosity towards Japan. Much of the emphasis on patriotism and patriotic history that was developed or encouraged by the Chinese leaders in the early 90s, but has been there as an undercurrent all along, have been to remind people of the atrocities that the Japanese committed when they attacked China in the 1930s and through to the mid-40s. And in that sense, anti-Japanese sentiment has been a very important element of the new nationalism and patriotism in China. So that when, for example, a leading intellectual last year, was it last year? Yes, I think it was last year, suggested that maybe there was time for new thinking in dealing with Japan, and that it was high time that the Chinese people put behind them this sense of victimhood, and that they should really think how to reach across to Japan. Well, the poor man found himself hounded. There was a whole campaign in the internet proclaiming him a traitor. His house had things thrown at it, and in the end he left his place and went to live in Hong Kong. And I cite this just as an example. There are many others to show the virulent, almost sort of hatred that exists towards Japan amongst people your age in China, in Chinese universities and so on. So it's not people who are, if you like, who belong to the mob, like who feel this. These are the younger, well-educated people in China who feel this, even though they themselves did not experience the atrocities themselves. Nevertheless, they carry it forward. Now, this provides a backdrop against improving relations with Japan. As far as Japan itself is concerned, there is a sort of a growing movement there to think afresh about what kind of role Japan should play in international affairs. There's a feeling that Japan cannot simply carry on by denying itself an independent role in international affairs because of security treaty with the United States. So in effect, this brings the United States into the middle of the relationship between Japan and China. It is by the security alliance that the United States has with Japan that reassures Japan's neighbors that Japan will not develop an independent military force again, that Japan will not deploy military force in the Asian area again. So in a way, it is the United States which is seen by China as the guarantor of good relations with Japan. Similarly, with regard to Japan, there is, as they see it, the continual rise of the Chinese military, which is really directed towards Taiwan, makes them more dependent on the United States. But on the other hand, there's a feeling that the United States cannot necessarily be trusted to help Japan in its hour of need, should that arise with regard to China, because the United States has a complicated relationship with China and wants to cooperate with it on many issues. So so here, even at a time when the United States regards China as a partner on the war of terrorism, there are clearly problems here. And these are very deep-seated ones, because ultimately they affect the nature of the Chinese identity and the basis by which the Chinese government sees itself being able to continue in office. And this doesn't mean to say that US-China relations are necessarily bound to have conflict. What it means is that they require careful management. There's a way in which if you like, Sino-Japanese relations require careful management. All the time, there are all kinds of accidents and issues that come up that cause people, both in Japan and in China, to get very angry with each other. And then it requires the two sets of leaders to meet so as to, if you like, pour water on the flames and cool things down. And the United States, therefore, has to really find a way of better coexistence with China than it has been able to achieve. Most American scholars who focus on the relationship with China identify a sense in which there is an unevenness to it, that they come closer together and then they break apart, and it's a cycle almost of continual ups and downs. And I've identified really sort of three reasons for it. One is the clash of values between the two systems, if you like, which are current in the two countries. Another has to do with the issues of Taiwan and Japan. But I suppose a third one would have to be, how does the United States accommodate the rise of China? Because although it's expressed primarily in economic terms, it has political consequences. And I think this is, insofar as China's economic rise can continue, I think it is possible that the Chinese leaders will recognize that it's in their interest, as much as anyone else, for them to be more flexible on the two big issues, as I said before, of Taiwan and of Japan. So so I don't want to end, as it were, on a pessimistic note. I think that that it is entirely possible for the Chinese and the American sides to build on the partnership which they have, and but it does require, I think, careful management on both sides. So thank you very much. Well, in a way it's both. It's a coincidence of both. The Chinese interest in this really developed piecemeal, starting way back in the late 80s when Gorbachev came to power.